Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. It's a pleasure to be here. As Pierce was mentioning, my name is Christophe. I'm from SKIM Singapore, and joining me today is Sarah from SKIM London. Sarah is based in the UK, but joining me today for presenting. We've got a very interesting topic. We've got about 15 minutes to present this, so I won't pretend that I will tell you all about those topics: customer experience, consumer journey. We will need probably 2 weeks to go through it in detail. But hopefully by the end of those 15 minutes, you'll get some good learnings, actionable insights that you can take away with you from your presentation. As you can see, what we're talking about today is customer experience and consumer journey, two terms which we use a lot in our business, whether we're an agency or whether we're on the client side. Typically, when we mean by customer experience, as we know, customer experience is all about the way we interact, or the way a brand interacts with its consumers. It's a little bit different from consumer journey. For consumer journey, we're talking about the stages a customer travel and in its relationship with a brand. So two things are a little bit different. I will argue that nowadays, in the marketing environment, given market forces that we have, both needs to be measured at the same time. I think if you're a bank, if you're an airline, if you're credit card company, if you're a service industry, you already know customer experience very well. You've got touch points that you measure very closely. You have indicators, you have KPIs, you've got net promoter scores, so nothing new. You've got dashboards, everything is properly documented, everything is in place. However, I will argue that this is no longer sufficient. We need to think of going as a next step, as a client, as an agency also for us to bring you solutions along those fields. Why? Well, it's very simple. As we all know, the landscape has changed tremendously nowadays. If we see on the left, we still have, I would say, a marketing funnel. We just want to bring consumers, especially from an FMCG standpoint, we want to bring consumers for various stages of buying, using our brand, from being aware to considering them, to preferring them, to purchasing them and being loyal with them. But this little funnel is becoming extremely complicated to figure out because nowadays we have so many touch points that come into play. That's one thing. We have a lot of touch points, and some of them play different roles at different stages of where we are in our journey. And chief to that is the online touch point, which we all know is nowadays extremely complicated to figure out because the online, I would say, arena has multiple roles. We can use it for advertising, we can use it for word of mouth, we can use it for shopping. So the online channel is really a difficult one to crack in terms of insights. And it's also the one that nowadays consumers use the most. If we want to follow consumers where they go, they are literally online. And not just online, they're on mobile. So when you talk, all of a sudden, we can really see that customer experience is becoming a little bit more complex to measure with this kind of forces, which is precisely why, as an agency or for us, when we do research, when we do surveys, now there's a lot of our clients are asking us, well, customer experience, I understand, I get that, we measure this very well. However, we always advocate that try to step back and add another dimension to those things, which is the customer journey. I think you've all heard about this term, we're all familiar with it somehow, somewhere. It's a hot topic, it's a buzzword, but what are we talking about specifically? So I thought I would really bring it back today on slides. It's a journey, as we all know, so you can see that we have stages, steps. Remember that we have the blue steps, which is all about buying the brand, and the orange circle, which is all about experiencing it, and after that, advocating it and bonding with our brand. So I can walk you through to the stages again. We have the latent stage, where basically we don't really need something. We are fine with what we have or don't have. Then all of a sudden, somewhere, there's a touch point that creates a trigger. I said, oh, I'm interested. There's something that makes me curious about something. I might want to consider buying a product or a service. It could be, for example, that maybe your mobile phone plan is up for renewal in about 6 months' time. You might be thinking, well, it's about time to think of what I want to do next. Am I going to stay with the same carrier? Am I going to trade up? Am I going to change phone and so forth? So all of a sudden, you become a little bit more in a considering stage, a little bit more active. Moving forward, you can see that sometimes as your journey progresses, you can be reaching an evaluating stage where you're really thinking about making choices. Which one am I going to go for? Which airline should I go with? Which bank should I go with? Which one should I choose if I'm going to take a loan, if I'm getting married, if I need to buy a car or a house? And that all of a sudden, I'm starting to evaluate things much more closely. And then you reach the buying stage where it's decision time. So we're going to look at those touch points and really see what is the best way nowadays in research to integrate them with customer experience. Moving further, you can see that we have experience. Here we are experiencing the brand. This is where typically where all of, I would say, brand owners measure the brand experience very well. That's typically the stage we're in. And we advocate and bond with the brand. Hopefully we don't get out of the circle, and I would say recommend not to use the brand. We stay in this circle. We don't go back from stage 5 to stage 0. We go from 5 to 6. To illustrate this a little bit more concretely, I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who's going to tell you all about what do I mean by all these things.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and thanks for having us here today again. So just trying to bring this to life. We're not trying to talk in abstract terms or talk theory at you guys. This is the reality that consumers go in when they're making a decision, when they're experiencing these different touch points about different brands. So we try to think really about ourselves. And you know, I've got to know Christophe. He's a very dedicated runner. So we can switch to the next slide. We have a, do you want to switch? Sure. Sorry. We have a couple of slides here. One shows you a very professional looking runner. This is Christophe. He's the kind of guy I'd love to think I am as a runner. I'm not. I'm that kind of runner that gets myself out when it's a particularly sunny day. This is a picture of me running through Central Park just a couple of weeks ago. When we were thinking about the decision journey that we made when it came to buying trainers, actually Christophe's the kind of guy that you can just see him just browsing in a store. So he's actually just looking. He's often in these places just keeping aware of what the current brands are that are being released into the market. He's just, in terms of his journey, he's keeping his awareness very high. And actually, when it comes to making that purchase decision, he might make it very quickly because he's already aware to a very high level of what there is in the market. Conversely, myself, as a runner, I actually saw an Instagram post from my friend. This is actually, it's probably time dated, 11 weeks ago, something like that. Now, my friend posted a pair of shoes with a medal that she'd just won that morning. I was like, oh, nice shoes. And I think I actually commented again, I think they look nice. And this is actually, on the next slide, is the actual conversation we end up having, which was, well done, and I love the shoes. And then I came back to her a couple of days later, because I just wanted to find that Instagram post again. I was like, I keep looking at those shoes. And she actually said, oh, you should get a pair, because we were going to New York together. You should get a pair, and we can match in NYC. Which actually started me on this decision journey, where I spoke to her. I looked online to see if I could find the exact pair of shoes she had, found out that they were cut for narrow feet, didn't like them. Then I went into a physical store. I ended up trying to then find a New Balance store. I looked online to find out where one was. I did some research online. I chatted to some friends. I then planned a trip to New York. I used my mobile device again to locate a store in New York, and I went in, and I actually did make the purchase in a physical store. Now, all of these different touch points had an influence in my journey as I progressed through the stage of consideration, evaluation, considering different brands. But as I considered this touch point, the very first time I went to the website versus the second time I went to the website, where I was at in my mindset was massively different. And this is the kind of thing we want to come back to. What are your consumer touch points? And as a brand manager, where are people in their mindset when they come to those touch points? Knowing where they're at helps you optimize what that touch point looks like. Why are people there? What are they looking for? So going back to this journey and trying to tie in that experience, I was in latent phase. I wasn't even thinking about trainers until my friend posted this Instagram post of a very exciting, very bright neon orange pair of trainers that I thought looked so cool. That moved me into consideration phase, and those different touch points that I used of the website, physical store, chatting to friends, that moved me through into the evaluation through to buy. I am now in the experiencing phase. I'm starting to advocate for them because they're very comfortable. If you want trainers, come to me. I'll tell you about how awesome mine are. And I'm bonding with my trainers. And I'm here telling you about my trainers. I never thought I would tell people about my trainers. I'm not that kind of runner. But moving through, so it really is considering where I was at in those journeys and how I use those different touch points to get there.
Moving forward in our presentation, now that you can really see that we need to integrate customer experience with the extra dimension of the consumer journey, we're going to try to illustrate with you, share a very concrete case study of what does it mean business-wise and research-wise. How can you leverage consumer journey in your studies to get more really clear insights on which touch point comes into play and when. Okay. We're going to share with you a little of a case study of research that we've done in the US for a telco operator in wireless. We wanted to understand how do consumers go about renewing their wireless plans specifically. What were the forces, what were the touch points that would come into play, and which touch point was impacting who at what stage. Our client was measuring customer satisfaction in, I would say, in a traditional way. They knew about how satisfied their customers were, their competitors were doing, and so forth, but they felt that somehow, somewhere, there was something missing to really nail, to get the sales, to make sure that loyal consumers would stay with them, that the loyal consumers would also trade up, and that they would also gain market share from their competitors. So this is how we went about it. We adopted what we call a decision journey mapping approach, and this is something which we can of course replicate in many categories. One of the key findings that we found when we used this approach was that on average, the consumers that they were researching, observing, have about 4 touch points before making a purchase. Not just 10, not 10, not 15, not 20. They were making a purchase decision when it was decision time to renew their plan, to buy a wireless plan. 4 touch points were coming into play. That's all of a sudden the scope was becoming much more narrow. So it was becoming really critical to make sure we're really hitting the right touch point. And by hitting the right touch point, I mean spending at the right place if you're a marketeer. That was one of the key insights that was, I would say, highly eye-opening to our client. But there was more than that. We found out that when consumers make decisions, and perhaps this is not a new term to most of you here, at one point, somehow, somewhere, we're going to have a tipping point, something that's going to make us take a decision, take a stand. So just I thought I would share with you a definition of what we mean by tipping point in a consumer journey mindset. What we mean by that is that moment that changes everything, that moment when a consumer decides which brand, which product he or she is going to buy. Sooner or later, there's going to be a tipping point. The name of the game these days is where is it and how is it formed and at what stage does it occur. We all have tipping points when we buy products. That's really, I would say, the most important thing we need to understand when it comes to choosing, selecting brands. So we'll try to really figure out, say, what does the tipping point come into action in this research process? And very interestingly, we found out that in this situation, the tipping point was coming very early at the decision stage when it comes to buying, to renewing the wireless plan. Very interestingly, we found out that nearly a third of consumers were reaching a tipping point at the first touch point, which means the very first touch point that they were using to get some information or to decide which brand or which, I would say, telco operator they're going to go with to buy a wireless plan was really the one that would make them choose, obviously. So meaning whatever you do after that, the other tipping points, the other touch points, were no longer relevant. You could spend a lot of money on other touch points. It didn't matter. Consumers had already chosen whether they would go or not go with you. So it was really crucial to invest at the right touch point. And that's sizable. We're talking about nearly a third. So if it's in the US, you can imagine the scale of what a third means. Moving deeper into those insights that we got when we took this consumer decision journey approach, we found out also that in terms of, as I said, nearly a third, 29%, close to it, we found out that the touch point per se that came into play, those that were the tipping point were the store, the website, and word of mouth. I mean, it's just an illustration of when you take such approach, all of a sudden you know exactly which one is going to be the tipping point. So in this stage, the store was playing a huge role to really selling or reselling or upgrading trading up customers. So essentially, like I said, this is where you need to invest if you know consumers need to decide or renew a plan and so forth. Another insight that came out with this kind of approach, going beyond customer experience, but taking a journey approach, we found out that millennials, which is for all of us, I would say a very strategic segment of consumers, were 3 times more likely to research on social media at tipping point, which means they were very close to the tipping point. They were about to make a decision, yet they needed to get more information about how they should buy a wireless plan. For this generation, for this segment, they were much more, how can I say, they had a higher propensity to use social media to make a decision. They would go to blogs, they would go to Facebook and so forth. They would go to forums to discuss, hey, which telco operator should I go with? That was highly insightful, as opposed to other generation, which may not have the same behavior. So we found out the tipping points, we were able to map it out. Interestingly, after that also, we found out that still, even when consumers have made up their mind, they knew which operator they would go with, they still continue their journey which means beyond the tipping point, there are still touch points that come into play. Even if the decision is made, they are still exposed to advertising. They will still use touch points which are related to a brand, maybe to reassure them about if they made the right choice, or maybe to get additional information. But from a marketing standpoint, it means that those touch points strategically are a little bit less important in terms of where you should spend money precisely. We also went beyond that. We tried to put this journey in terms of, we try to really integrate satisfaction and journey together, as I was explaining earlier on. So let me share a little bit of what I mean by that. This is a chart that illustrates a measurement of customer satisfaction according to the stages consumers are in. So as you can see on the left, we have different stages. We have the buying stage, we have the considering stage, and we have the latent stage. So 3 charts totally separate from each other. And for each of these charts, we are measuring satisfaction for various touch points that come into play in this industry. So for example, we had make the experience easy, gives more plans, device, and service options. We have a lot of touch points which are relevant in the telco industry. What we're doing after that is, you can see on the right-hand side, we have 4 brands, 4 telco operators, and we were tracking the satisfaction of consumers across those touch points. So you can see that how satisfaction performs for each touch point for each brand A, B, C, D. So the interesting bit to remember in this chart is that, as you can see in the latent stage, we have, I would say, the brand which is, if we can see in the color, you can see we have one brand which is above the rest, performing better. Brand B seems to be satisfying, delighting customers a few notches better than the others. But all of a sudden, the landscape becomes a little bit different when consumers are in the consideration stage. You can see that it's a much more, I would say, it's a much closer fight. All the brands seems to be close together. You can also see that appearing somehow, somewhere, brand D seems to be dropping out of the race a little bit, being, how can I say, dropped. And even more interestingly enough, when it was decision time, when it was buying time, meaning when consumers were about to choose a new plan, at that stage you can see that it was a whole different new ball game when a new brand had all of a sudden taken over. So the point I'm making is that if we had taken, I would say, a normal, conventional satisfaction measurement approach, we wouldn't have found this. We would have been able to say, yep, all the brands seems to be fine, Net Promoter Score seems to be in place. However, we wouldn't have gotten the depth saying, well, at decision time, one brand is really doing a better job than the other. And other brands seem sometimes to be dropping out at various touch points.
Yeah, so I think we're really trying to bring this to life. So we're saying, if you're a brand and you are brand B, which would be brand C, which would be the green one, and you're mapping out how you're being perceived by consumers along these different metrics, whether consumers get the plans they want, do they feel you're making clear recommendations, are you doing a good job? If you're measuring consumers, but you're capturing them in the wrong emotion or wrong stage in their buying journey, you think you're doing fine. You think you're right up there with everybody else. But actually, when it comes down to it, you're actually underperforming on quite a few metrics. That's when it's really important to know where consumers are in their decision journey. When you're asking them these questions, how important those touch points actually matter in that moment, because that's when they're making the buying decision. That's when it's important that you perform well on these different drivers.
Yep. Okay. Moving forward, I'm going to wrap up with a few key learnings. I'm very mindful of time, make sure that we are on schedule. So what does it mean? What it's all about? Essentially, a few takeaways that we would like to share with you today is really, we need to go beyond satisfaction. This is a given nowadays. We really encourage brands to go on a decision journey mapping approach to understand what are the trigger analysis, what makes me go from one stage to another. This is really the very, how can I say, precious piece of insights that we need to acquire very urgently. Then we need to proceed with touchpoint mapping. Where are the touchpoints that come into play? Where are the tipping points? I think we've highlighted that very clearly, hopefully. And we also have, it's all about connecting the dots, not just measuring satisfaction, but measuring the journey of how the satisfaction evolves over time. All of a sudden, things are very dynamic. So in summary, what we would recommend, a few points to take with us today, is really understand the stages consumers are in, measure customer experience by stages. Really, that's, I would say, one of the most important point that we are sharing today, and determine performance and impact of touch point by stages. That gives you the chance to really invest at the right place at the right time. And in the buying stage, especially if you're a brand or if you're a service which has, I would say, an extended cycle of purchasing or renewal, when the cycles are a little bit long, it's really key to really adopt I would say, a buying stage decision journey mapping process. Thank you very much. I hope that makes sense. Thank you.